This is Pilanesbergen National Park, located in the northwest province of South Africa. It's one of many parks and reserves vital to South Africa's tourism industry, which accounts for 7% of the country's GDP and employs over 1.5 million people. And the money those tourists spend helps protect the animals and their environment. But on March 27, 2020, this vital source of revenue was cut off, widening an already significant funding gap critical to conservation and combating the illegal poaching industry, which spans the globe. The country imposed a nationwide lockdown to help curb the spread of COVID-19. The borders were shut, international and domestic flights were prohibited, and national parks and reserves were closed to visitors. The result was a conservation crisis.
In addition to the incredible impact COVID has had on the health of our citizens and our healthcare infrastructure across Africa, as well as our economies, it has had a cataclysmic impact on wildlife conservation across the continent. A majority of our funding in Eastern and Southern Africa, so that includes South Africa, comes from tourism. The tourism industry essentially generates revenue that supports our rangers, our protected area management, as well as provides community benefits. When the ban in March 2020 was put in place, it essentially shut off our revenue stream for conservation management.
What we were predicting back then was the long-term impacts, which were going to be the most worrying to conservation, and that was around the sustainability of the financial models for a lot of reserves. For the last 6 or 8 months, that's been the real story, is the financial pipelines have been cut off. There are a lot of models, if we talk specifically South Africa, that are very reliant on tourism dollars to keep their conservation activities going, and that comes down to paying salaries, fuel for vehicles, other staff costs, logistical costs, and keeping these reserves going. What was already a resource scarce environment became even scarcer, and it's put a lot of pressure on.
There are 21 national parks and over 500 private game reserves in South Africa, and they're home to an array of plants and animals, all vital to the stability of their ecosystems. But that stability is continuously threatened by poachers who hunt specific species for profit. This type of poaching is largely carried out by organized criminal syndicates who kill high-value species like rhino for their horns and sell them in markets like China and Vietnam, where they are prized for their supposed medicinal properties and as status symbols. Though the value of rhino horn varies, experts say it's a highly lucrative industry.
We have within South Africa, which is sometimes a little bit different to other countries, we have wildlife sitting both within the government parks. So we have national parks, we have provincial parks, which are obviously dotted all over the country. But we also have animals, including rhino and elephant, in private parks, so in private hands. The poaching would happen both in government and in private reserves. And those are within specific areas that, as you can imagine, are not so much within the kind of urban economic hubs of the country. The product would then be moved into economic hubs such as Johannesburg, which is obviously where the main transport routes, and particularly with rhino horn, we see it moving out by air transport rather than by sea or land, where it would then go via various routes, whether it be through a transit country such as Malaysia or Singapore, on its way then through to East Asia, where obviously that is where the big demand is, particularly for rhino horn.
When COVID lockdowns were implemented, movement within and outside of the country was heavily restricted. The usual smuggling routes were cut off, and the country saw a noticeable decrease in the poaching of high-value species like rhino, which dropped 33% in 2020, according to a recent government report.
All the reserves themselves were closed down, so access control was extremely tight and limited. So people weren't going into reserves, whether they be tourists or contractors or excess tourism staff members, etc. The trade routes themselves were just brought to a halt. There were no flights coming in and out of the country, or very limited amounts. What we knew at the time, though, was that was going to be short-lived.
And as soon as those restrictions were lifted, for example, in November and December of 2020, we already saw an escalation. while we have those lockdowns in place, and also with the international travel not being at the point at which it's at, we did definitely see less detections happening at the airport. You know, it was much harder to sneak through goods that shouldn't be on specific aircraft. And as more aircraft come into the airport and as travel increases, obviously because of the volume of what's happening, it does become more difficult to do the work we do.
The international wildlife trade, I think, is the fourth biggest illegal market in the world. And, you know, we're talking billions of dollars here. You know, since the hard lockdowns were let go, we knew that the syndicates were going to respond. You know, they're agile. They also they have the ability to adapt, and they don't play by any rules. Yeah?
While poaching at the hands of criminal syndicates decreased, the country saw an increase in a different kind of poaching.
I think one also needs to understand poaching within the South African context against the background of fairly high levels of poverty in and around a lot of our parks and nature reserves. There was an increase in poaching of animals for meat consumption. And as you can imagine, you know, as job opportunities diminished, as there was a big economic downturn, people were actually looking for poached meat, you know, to survive.
What COVID has done is it's put huge strain on communities. It's increased unemployment, it's increased food insecurity. So all of these dynamics communities are facing. They're making decisions to put food on the table. That's the bottom line.
On the ground, the war against poaching is waged by game rangers. Among their many duties, rangers are tasked with ensuring the safety and well-being of the animals within the country's parks and reserves. Game rangers were declared essential workers by the South African government, and they continued to patrol vast areas of protected land. It's a difficult and dangerous job, one made even more difficult by the pandemic. Many game ranger units are stretched thin, and the pandemic has created new challenges both in the field and in the rangers' personal lives.
I would say, like, since COVID-19 hit us the beginning of last year through to this year, it has had a huge impact or implications into the job that I do now, where you cannot really perform your objective. We are a private game reserve. We don't get any, assistance from the government itself. So everything that we do to conserve our reserve relies more onto tourism.
Skilled ranging is not like before, where you just go and monitor your animals. You also now in a situation of being in contact with poachers, but then it was hectic for rangers because now it means having to be in the park, adhering to the social distancing and stuff. So it means for those that are now at work, it means long hours for them. It means now covering for those that are not on duty at that point in time. So it was then hectic.
There were times where I feel like, I can't just go to bed. Let me take a vehicle and, just drive along the boundaries, more especially in full moons, because I know that the poachers might use the full moon as an opportunity. And as I've said earlier, that, we travel quite quickly and people will immediately know that there's less staff patrolling the reserve.
Financially, it affected me. I'm a mother of two. The minute when they said it's lockdown level 5, then my kids had to stop going to school. For me, it means now I had to hire someone to help me with the kids while I'm at work. So financially now I had to attend to something that I did not plan, for.
As the world slowly begins to open up again, a resurgence in commercial poaching and a growing funding gap remain significant threats to conservation. The pandemic exacerbated many of the funding issues already faced by conservationists, and it's forcing them to look for new ways to diversify their sources of revenue.
It cast a real light on the fragility of our entire financial structure for conservation. And so if there's any upside to COVID, my hope is that it has made us realize that we need to diversify and develop more resilient structures for the future of conservation in Africa.
And of course, because as South Africa, we have a lot of biodiversity, whether it be plants or animals, In a way, I always say that our richness in terms of biodiversity is actually our Achilles heel as well. So, the demand, we have the supply to kind of meet the demand, unfortunately.
There are some really good teams out there. In other places, we're losing the war. If we look at the figures on population growths in some areas, it's difficult to say we're succeeding across the board. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
We need a huge support in terms of backing from the donors, the backing from the government, anyone that is keen to invest into conservation.
It's a battle, right? But what I can say is that rangers are doing their part. And we need to remember something, that conservation is not just for rangers, it's for all of us. We need each other in this battle.